welcome back to Intro to Tech Skills here at Microsoft Build. I'm one of your hosts, Salman, and I'm here with Gwen. What have we got on now?
Yeah, time to get hands-on with a couple different programming languages. Salman, I want to make sure you pay extra attention to this one.
Yeah, so I've learned that it's not actually the languages I've learned in school, where it's German or French, and it's also not coffee. So yeah, what are we actually going to be learning?
Exactly. So we're going to get hands-on and create a hello world with 3 different programming languages. Now it is time to welcome and hand off to our speaker for this session, Microsoft Cloud Developer Advocate, Christopher.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be for everybody tuning in. This is Hello World in 3 languages. Now, before we get into that, let's take a look at where we are in this roadmap. We are on day 1, and actually we're right at the end of day 1. Day 1, the runway to getting started, where hopefully you've seen quite a bit about technology, about programming, and hopefully you checked out the session that was just before mine, where a fantastic panel talked about the answer to the most common question, which is which programming language should I start with? And what I want to do is really continue that conversation, because I think if you're going to make that decision, you should see those programming languages. And we're going to do this by doing Hello World. Now, if you're not already familiar with Hello World, it might look a little bit like this. And this is how Hello World looks in C++. Now, if a lot of that looks a little bit confusing, and I'm going to be honest, because I'm not a C++ developer, that looks a little confusing to me, don't worry. We're going to focus in on 3 of the most common programming languages, C#, Python, and JavaScript. But before we see those languages, let's talk a little bit about Hello World and introduce this gentleman right here, Brian Kernighan. Brian Kernighan is the person who brought Hello World into the developer lexicon. Turns out he was writing a book about the programming language B, which, by the way, if you're curious if B was a predecessor to C and C++ and C#, the answer to that question is yes. And also, if you're curious if maybe there was a programming language called A before that, the answer to that question is yes as well. So he was writing a programming language writing a book on the programming language B, and the demo that he included in there, the first demo, was to print out Hello World. And that's actually the end of the story. Like, there's no groundbreaking moment. It was simply that he included this in his book. It became a little bit popular, and then it basically just grew to a life of its own. And in fact, this is sort of the most common thing that any developer will do when they go to learn a brand new programming language or a brand new framework. There are even websites that are out there which will show you how to write out Hello World in dozens of different programming languages. It's just that popular. Like I said at the outset, though, we're going to focus in on these 3 languages here, Python, C#, and JavaScript. These 3 languages were chosen partly because of their popularity. They're 3 of the most common programming languages in the world, but also because of the fact that that was the conversation, again, that we just saw. So we want to build on top of that. Now, if you're anything like me, and I know I am, the best way to learn something is to actually see it, to actually do it. So let's get in and start doing the demo for Hello World for Python, JavaScript, and C#. I'm going to do all of this inside of Visual Studio Code. And you'll notice that I've got 3 little folders set up here that I'm going to do my demos inside of. Python, JavaScript, and C#. Let me make that a little bit bigger. There you go. Now you can see those 3 folders right there. Let me go into my Python folder here. And I'm going to create a brand new file by hitting that little file icon with the plus. And I'm going to name this demo.ipynb. Now I'm calling it demo because I'm very creative in my naming. And I'm giving it an extension of IPYNB to create a Python notebook, or sometimes called a Jupyter notebook. And if you're not already familiar with notebooks, what this allows me to do is to have an interactive environment where I can write some code, I can play around with some data, and I can see the results right here. This is an extremely popular tool with data scientists and with people that are just starting to learn how to program in Python. Because what's great is that I'm going to be able to write my code inside of this cell right here, hit this little play button right here, and it will run my code and display any output right below it. So let's display out our hello world. And the way that we display text in Python is by using the word print. Now you are going to notice here that Visual Studio Code is helping me out a little bit. The moment I start typing, it starts to try and figure out, hey, what are you likely going to be looking for? So when I start with the letter P there for print, it automatically gives me print up at the very top. And I could use a tab here to have it then auto-complete. You're going to notice with Python, because of the fact that it's designed to be relatively close to English, that it has, I don't know, almost like a little bit of a friendly quality to it. That I want to print something out onto the screen, I use the word print. I kind of like that. Now, print is what's known as a function, which is basically just something that I can call and I can give some information to. And the information that I want to give it is the text that I want to display out onto the screen. And in my case, that's going to be hello world. So I'll use my double quotes here. Could actually use single quotes as well, but I'm going to use double quotes. There's my double quotes, and then there is my string literal of hello world. And I can hit this play button right over here on the left, and voila, that will display out hello world. Pretty cool. Now, if I want to get a little bit fancier here, maybe I want to read a little bit of information in from the user. I want to get some input. Then I can do that by using the input command. And so what input will do is it will ask me, hey, what's the prompt? What do you want to display out to the user? And I could say, what is your name? Like that. Let's spell name correctly. That will probably help. And then this will actually give me back a piece of information. It will give me back what the user typed in. And I can store this inside of what is known as a variable. A variable is a placeholder for some piece of information. That if you've ever taken a math class and maybe you had a formula, something that looked like this, with like 206 minus x equals 42. There we go, 42. It's my first day with a keyboard. But I had a little bit of a formula like that. 206 minus x equals 42. That little x here is a variable. It's a placeholder. It's a placeholder for a value. And in this case, that value would be 164, doing some real quick math here. And up above, that variable is just going to store whatever value is given back to me by the user. So I can use input here. This will give me back the information that the user typed in. And then we'll print out hello, and then the name, like that. So let's play this. And then there's the prompt right up top here. What is your name? And let's type in Christopher and hit enter. And now out on my screen is displayed out, hello, Christopher. Now, the big thing that I want you to take away from Python here is notice how all of this is designed to be relatively close to English, input, print, and I want you to notice that on my variable here, that I didn't need any special keyword to indicate, hey, I'm going to be using a variable. Let's take our next step here into C#. And I'm going to do something a little bit different for C#. I could continue to use a notebook that would actually work just fine. but I actually want to create a full application with C#. So inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm going to open up a terminal window here. This just gives me access to the command line. And there's a shortcut key for it, but you can also hit View and Terminal right here, and that will give that to you. And I'm going to change directories into C#. And then I'm going to use the command line utility to create a .NET application called .NET. And the command is going to be .NET New. Now, .NET New is actually used to create any type of app that you might want. So if I was going to be creating a web app, if I was going to be creating a Windows app, I can use .NET New to create all of those. In my example here, I'm going to create what's known as a console app. And a console app is designed to run inside of this terminal window. It's designed to run inside of a command prompt, inside of a console. And I'll hit enter here. And that has now created a brand new console app. Let's go see what was created here, shall we? I'm going to close out that window. I'm going to open up my Explorer right here. And you'll notice my C# folder has a lot of new stuff inside of here. .NET New created all of that for me. Now, you could go in and explore all of that and see what's going on. I'm not too worried about everything, though. I instead want to focus in on that program right there. That program is going to be where my code is. And what do you know? It actually includes the code for me for console write-line. And this is very common whenever you're using a utility to create an application for you, that it will typically create it'll invoke a template, and it will automatically have some level of code pre-built for you. And this can be extremely helpful when you're looking to create an application, so that way I don't have to start completely from scratch here. And so you'll notice there is the code for Hello World. Now you're going to notice a couple of very big differences between this and Python. That we don't have print, we don't have input. Instead, you're going to notice that we've got this thing called console, and we've got this thing called write-line. So let's try to break this down a little bit. Write-line here is going to write out a line of text. And that line of text that it's going to write out is the information that we pass into the parentheses there. And in this case, that's going to be hello world. So that write line makes sense. Now let's take a look at console out here. Console is going to represent the console. It's going to represent that command prompt, that terminal window. And so I can use console to interact with that. In programming terms, console is what's known as an object. Just like, for example, the pen that I'm holding up right here would be an object, or the microphone that's in front of me, or really anything is an object. That if I can interact with it, it's an object. And in programming, it's a very big concept, that these objects are things that I can interact with. There are things that I can do different things with. And in this case, that console, that object, I want to do something with it. What do I want to do? I want to print out some text. I want to print out, in this case, hello world. So that's where that write line will come into play. The last big thing that I want you to notice here is that semicolon at the end. If you remember back to Python, no semicolons. But here, we've got a semicolon. And this is something that will vary from language to language. Some languages, like C#, need a semicolon at the end of every line of code. Other languages, like Python, don't need that. And this is just something you'll have to just sort of kind of roll with as you go from language to language. You may also notice just the capital C, the capital W, the capital L. And that's just a little bit of common convention. That's also going to vary a little bit from language to language. C# likes to start things with capital letters. So the capital C, the capital W, the capital L there to break all of that down. Okay, enough talking about it. Let's actually run the code here. So back over here to my terminal window, and let me just clear my screen just so I can get back to the top. And I'm going to say .NET run. Poof. And that will now run my code and display out hello world. By the way, the little sound effects, that's completely up to you. But my personal opinion is sound effects help writing code. They do. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let's plus this up a little bit. Let's gussy this up. I want to also now display out hello and then somebody's name. So how can we do that? Well, the way that we can do that is by first displaying out some information. So I'm going to say console write, and the big difference between, there we go, the big difference between the write and the write line is that write will not automatically put in a carriage return or an enter at the end. So I'll be able to say, what is your name? And then I'm going to read in some data. So I'm going to say var name equals, and we'll say console read line like that. So that will read in whatever the user types in. You're going to notice again a little bit of difference here between Python and C#. That read line kind of getting maybe a little bit more technical than input. And you're also going to notice that we need a keyword here at the very beginning to indicate that we're creating a variable. So in this case, I'm using var to indicate that I'm creating a variable. Well, let me save my code. Let me say .NET run, hit enter. And now it says, what is your name? Christopher. There we go. And then it displays out, whoops, it's not hello world. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to add in the name. There you go. I did that on purpose because I want you to see that not every developer is perfect, that we all make mistakes. So I did that on purpose. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. All right, let's do this one more time. .NET run, what is your name? And Christopher, hit enter, and now it prints out, hello, Christopher. Cool. So now we've seen Python and we've seen C#. Let's close this out by taking a look at JavaScript. So let me just get ready down here. There we go. And let me open back up my file system, and let's go into JavaScript. And let me create a brand new file here that I'm going to call demo.js for JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is going to be sort of close to C#. But there's a couple of things that we need to understand about JavaScript before we start using it. That programming languages, in a lot of ways, are like spoken languages, and that they build around the people. They're built around, in the case of programming languages, where they're going to be used. And so JavaScript has its origins as a scripting language inside of a browser. And we can see this still to this very day. And so it's going to take on some of the aspects that we've seen in C#. You're going to notice maybe some little bit of familiarity with Java. And I want to make sure that I'm clear here. Java and JavaScript don't actually have any shared common parent language, that they are two separate languages there. But you are going to notice like a little bit of similarity sometimes in the syntax. So it's going to have a little bit of that, but it's also going to have a little bit of its own flair because of its background, because of its history. Now, the way that I'm going to display something out is I'm going to use console here. But you're going to notice that unlike in C#, there's no write here. That when I start typing out .w, that I get a warn here. But when I keep like typing out write, you're going to notice Visual Studio Code isn't helping me out here. Because there is no console write, there is no console write line. What there is, however, is a console log. And this is, again, because of the history of JavaScript. JavaScript was originally built to run inside of a browser. And that's kind of what it's expecting. It's expecting to be running inside of a host. So quite frequently, I'm going to be like updating what's displaying inside of the browser. And so displaying a little bit of text somewhere else through a console is going to be done a little bit differently. That normally, if I'm a developer and I'm going to be displaying out some text inside of the console, that's going to be some level of logging information. And in fact, you'll notice that I've got things like warn as well, which is just a different way for me to write out like some information for behind the scenes purposes. So that's why it's called log. It's because of that history. Now let's go ahead and say console log, and whoops, let's say hello world. There we go. And then now I'm going to put in a semicolon. Funny thing about JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't technically need semicolons. That you can actually write JavaScript without putting in semicolons. And a big part of the reason for that, and you're going to notice this quite a bit with JavaScript, is because, again, that history. It was designed to run inside of a browser. And a lot of times, the people that were writing the code there would make little mistakes. And so what the browser would do is it would try its best to interpret what it was that the user was trying to say, that the developer was trying to say, and still run the code. And so you notice those little quirks, you notice those little things about JavaScript. And I'm saying all of this as a way, honestly, to kind of say I like JavaScript because of that. I like its little quirks. I like those little types of things about it. So I can have the semicolon, I can leave it out. Personally, I'm a semicolon person. I really like putting them in there. But I also know a lot of JavaScript developers who don't like the semicolon, and that's fine. You can really go either way there. The last little thing that I want you to notice is the casing here is lowercase, lowercase. So lowercase c for console, lowercase l for log. And whoops, JavaScript, as well as C#, as well as Python, by the way, are all case sensitive, meaning that if the casing is different, that's going to mean something different. And that's true about most programming languages. And honestly, I think it's a great way to approach all programming languages, that if you treat everything like it's case sensitive, you're going to be fine. But if you treat something like it's not case sensitive and it turns out that it is, you're going to get errors. So just treat everything like it's case sensitive. It's going to make your life in the long run easier. OK, so now I need to run this code here. And so I'm going to run this inside of the console here. And I'm going to use an interpreter or runtime called Node. And I'll say Node and demo.js and hit enter. And this will now display out hello world. I'm going to close off JavaScript just by mentioning that I'm not going to do a read here, that I'm not going to input in information. And the reason for that is because trying to do that with JavaScript, again, because of that history, because of where it was originally designed to run, winds up being remarkably tricky. But I do at least want to show off a variable here. So I'm going to say var name equals, and then Christopher. And then let's go ahead and add in that plus name. So that way we can at least see what the variable looks like. I'm not quite sure why it's giving me, name is weird. How about presenter name? Will you be happy with that? Not quite sure why it's doing that, but that's all right. I'm just going to roll with it. There we go. The little line through wouldn't have actually made a difference. The code would have still run, but I just didn't want the line there. So I'm just going to rename that as presenter name. And now let's go ahead and rerun that. And now it displays out hello, Christopher. What I want you to notice is, again, that keyword var. Now, again, sort of sticking with that little bits of JavaScript, I can technically leave that out, but don't. Put var in there. It's going to make your life easier. So I've got var presenter name, and then I'm displaying out hello, and then in this case, that presenter name. And let's just run that one more time. And there is all of that in JavaScript. So there is how we can do hello world in Python, and we do that by using print. How we can do this in C#, and we do that by using console write line. And then last but not least, how we can do that in JavaScript, and that's going to be with console.log. Now, to break down those languages kind of one more time and do a little bit of a compare and contrast here. What you're going to notice is each one of these languages will have different features and different functionalities that are built around it. And you're also going to notice that each of these programming languages is going to have sort of a best case primary usage that, like I mentioned before, a programming language is much like a spoken language, that depending on the language that I'm speaking, I'm going to have different ways to express myself. I'm going to have different phrases, different things that I can use to convey emotion. And some of those might not exist from language to language to language. The same holds true with programming languages, that different programming languages, because of their nature, because of their history, are going to really shine for different uses. And so Python is great for creating web backends. It's great for doing scripting and behind the scenes automation like you might see in DevOps. And it's extremely popular with the data science crowd. Now, one of the big reasons for that is because the typing system is dynamic. And by typing, I don't mean typing on a keyboard, but rather the data types of a variable. That if you remember into my demo, what I did is I grabbed a string and I put that into a variable. And in the case of Python, in the case of JavaScript, I can actually change the type of that variable. So it's dynamic typing. And that can sometimes be very helpful if maybe I don't exactly know what the data is, or I just need to kind of manipulate it in different ways. So that can actually be very helpful sometimes. Python is also a little bit unique from other programming languages in that white space matters. So carriage returns, where you're tabbing in or spacing into, all of that really matters with Python, and it doesn't with C# and JavaScript. And the reason that it doesn't for C# and JavaScript is because C# and JavaScript use curly braces to mark off where code blocks are. Python doesn't do that. White space matters. And to me, my personal opinion, that's a really good thing for new developers. Because as a new developer, making sure that your code is easy to read, is well formatted, is really important. It's going to make your life easier. So when you go back to your code later on and maybe you need to debug it, or you're just trying to figure out what it was that you wrote, if it's neat, if it's clean, it's going to make your life that much easier. And so because of the fact that white space matters with Python, it sort of like, I don't want to say forces you into writing clean code, but it really helps encourage that in a way that other programming languages really don't. Python also has a lot of great benefits to it. That we mentioned that readability, but there's also a lot of libraries and community that's out there that if you're looking to do something in Python, you're very likely to find a project, you're very likely to find a community that's willing to work with you to help you do whatever it is that you want. The Python community is fantastic. Not to say that other communities aren't. Not trying to do that. But the Python community is fantastic. As far as C# goes, C# is really built for application development. So if you're looking to create web apps, if you're looking to create Windows apps, if you're looking to create mobile apps, if you're looking to create games, C# is a great language for all of that. Now, C# does have a couple little things that are going to come along with it, in that typing is going to be static, and it's going to have a lot of really strict rules and structure, although that's starting to change a little bit over time. Now, by that static typing, what I mean is that when I declare a variable, and that variable is like holding a string, it can't then later hold a number. And again, that can actually be sometimes a good thing, because now when I use a variable, I always know what's inside of it. And that can help me avoid a whole class of bugs, which is a really good thing. C# has been around for quite a while. There's been a lot of development into it. It's really mature. It's really stable. And it's also very popular in the enterprise. Last but not least is JavaScript. The best use case for JavaScript is web development. In fact, if you're going to be doing web development, you're going to need to know JavaScript. As a little aside here, I want to mention that as a developer, you're very likely going to need to learn multiple programming languages throughout the course of your career. And that, honestly, I think is a good thing, because you're going to learn new things by learning new languages. That, again, bringing this back to spoken languages. When you start to learn a second language, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to learn a lot more about your native language. Same thing holds true here. So don't be afraid to learn new programming languages. And so if you do web dev, you're going to have to learn JavaScript. JavaScript does have that dynamic typing, and it does have, like we mentioned, that sort of quirky syntax. And again, I kind of like it. I kind of like it. JavaScript does have some very nice speed, and it's interoperable. So I can use JavaScript. I can use that same language when I'm writing things that are going to run inside the browser, or things that are going to be running on the back end. All right. I am going to close all of this by giving you my opinion on what programming language you should learn first. And my answer is, it depends. Now, I'm not trying to just simply duck away from the question here, but the reason that I say that it depends is because it depends on what you want to build. Again, going back to that analogy of spoken language, that if you just sit down one day and say, hey, I'm going to learn this language for the sake of learning that language, it's probably not going to mean a lot to you, because languages are meant to be used. And so if you're learning a language with a goal in mind, maybe because there's a culture that interests you, or you're going to be visiting that country, or something like that, now that's going to mean something to you, and it's going to give you a goal to achieve. That same thing holds true with programming languages. So what do you want to do? What do you want to build? And that should then drive your choice. Because if I'm going to be doing web dev, if I'm going to be creating a game, if I'm going to be doing something with data science, I'm going to choose a language based around that, because now I'm going to have an interest in it, and that's going to help keep me going. So which programming language should you learn first? The answer really is, in my opinion, it depends. If you're really, really going to pin me down and say, hey, give me an answer, I'm probably going to say Python. And that's just because I feel like it's very flexible. I like that it's approachable. I like the fact that white space matters. But really, the true answer is, it depends on what you want to build with it. There is Hello World in 3 languages. Next steps is get in and start writing some code. If you want to learn about Python, C# or JavaScript, check out those links. You can find all of those resources and more at that Intro to Tech Skills GitHub repository, and you can see the link right down there at the very bottom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was awesome. Also, you happened to use one of my favorite programming languages in your demo, which is C#. So thank you for including that as well. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. And our first question here for you is, what programming language do you find yourself using most lately?
That's a great question. I find myself using Python most regularly, and a lot of that's just because of the space in which I play. That I really like a couple of web frameworks called Flask and Django, and so I find myself using Python quite a bit for those. So Python is probably one, and then JavaScript is probably a close second because I do a lot of web development as well. So those are probably the two that I find myself going to most frequently.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And we have another question, and that's what's the difference? I sometimes might get confused as well with this. And what's the difference between Java and JavaScript?
That is a great question. What's the difference between Java and JavaScript? And I sometimes like to joke that the only thing that Java and JavaScript share in common are the letters J-A-V-A. Now, Java and JavaScript do actually share a little bit of a common syntax, that you're going to notice that they're both going to use curly braces, that a lot of the constructs like if statement and so forth are going to look very similar. But the two are actually completely different and were developed completely separately. That JavaScript actually dates back to the early days of Netscape, which is one of the original browsers. And I unfortunately cannot remember what the original name of it was, but they decided to rename it as JavaScript because of the fact that Java was becoming very popular. So they were really just sort of looking to catch on to the name, even though they don't actually share anything in common. So JavaScript is, designed to run inside the browser. It's great for web development, while Java is probably closer to C#. If I was going to go with an analogy there, that with Java, I can do a lot of the same things that I could with C#, that I can create apps, I can create mobile apps, and things like that. So they are two very different programming languages, even though they might share a little bit of syntax, and they share those letters of J, A, V, and A.
I've actually used both of those languages, and I did not know that that's actually why JavaScript, like its name, became to be. It's a nice little fun fact to have. We got a few more here in the Q&A, but I think this is a pretty popular question for beginners. But do we have to be good at maths to become a developer?
That is a fantastic question. Do you have to be good at math to become a developer? And the answer to that question is no. You do not need to be good at math to become a developer. Now, one of the reasons, this is my own personal opinion, that math and programming became so intertwined is because they do share a lot of logic, that if you're good at math, then that might mean that you have an analytical mind, and that could mean then in turn that you are good at programming. And I think that's sort of like why those two came together. But you don't need to be good at math to be good at programming. So if you're not great at math, that's fine. And in fact, some of the best developers that I've ever met have art degrees and have music degrees. Music, I see a lot of crossover between programming and music. So yeah, you do not need to have a math degree at all to be a good developer.
Oh, thanks. And as someone who does like to play a lot of instruments, that's really nice to hear. And then going off of that, right? So people coming from art degrees, coming from business, what do you see are common transferable skills that help with programming?
What are common transferable skills that I see help with programming? I think the best thing is being able to do logic. I think is probably the biggest thing. And so I'm going to maybe shift this away a little bit from academic, but if you're good at, or if you're just looking to train the brain, if you will, maybe taking a look at logic puzzles, maybe taking a look at different, word puzzles, like crossword puzzles and things like that, just to sort of teach yourself how to approach things logically, to identify different patterns. That I think those are the types of things that can really help. So then maybe in turn, if we were going to bring this back to degrees, I think that like music can certainly be something like that, because there is just inherently some level of math in music, even if you're not necessarily always thinking about it. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, no, I don't know that I've got like a lot of other like good degrees that I could go along with that, but I'm sure somebody else does.
That is awesome, Christopher. I think we have time for about 2 more questions or so, and we've got a user here asking us about, you've been mentioning the word syntax in your session.
Yeah.
Could you define what syntax means?
Yeah, absolutely. So syntax is a relatively generic term for all of the different characters and other things that will help make a programming language understood by whatever is going to be running it. So let me kind of back this up real quick. When I'm writing Python, when I'm writing C#, when I'm writing JavaScript, when I'm writing any programming language, there's something that needs to actually interpret that and then tell the computer what it is that it's supposed to be doing there. So all of my programming languages, whatever it is that I'm going to be using, is going to be read by something else. And so that something else then needs to understand the code. And when we're then looking at something like, I need to branch my logic. So I'm writing some C# and I need to tell the computer, hey, if the user says this, I need you to do this. If the user does something else, then I need you to do something else. So that's what's known as an if statement. And the way that I program that, the way that I put all of that in, the words that I'm going to use, the characters that I'm going to use, all of that is generically going to be known as the syntax. If I was going to give an analogy, your syntax is sort of like your alphabet. So, different languages, as we go from like English to Japanese to Hindi to whatever other language it is, you're going to have different alphabets that are going to be used there. And you could view those sort of as syntax, because it's going to be those characters that are going to be brought together to then make language, to communicate ideas. That same thing holds true with a programming language. Is I'm going to have different characters, I'm going to have different keywords that I'm going to use to convey my message there. So to try and wrap that up there, because I think I went a couple of different directions. Syntax is that collection of keywords, it's that collection of characters that make up a language that I'm going to use to then tell the computer what I want it to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think we do have just time for one more question. And
yeah.
Hey, some people might have been watching Build from the beginning today, and Amanda was talking about .NET MAUI. And there's, this whole thing where you have WebAssembly and there's all this stuff about compilers. And the question is, how would a new framework like WebAssembly play a role in these programming languages? And we only have about 30 seconds to answer. But
30 seconds on a framework question. So real quick, so what a framework is there for is it's designed to help make your life easier as a developer. As a friend of mine likes to say, we're not launching rockets here. The point that he's trying to make when he says that is whatever it is we're doing, somebody else has probably done. And so they've created some tools that I can then use to make my life easier. So all of those different frameworks like .NET MAUI, those are frameworks. Those are there to help make my life easier.
Thank you so much, Christopher. We are at the end of this session. This has been packed with so many resources. For everyone, this is actually the last session for Intro to Tech Skills today, but tomorrow we'll be back here bright and early. That's it for us today. We will see you in the next one.
Bye.
Toodles.